right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you all for joining us for today's webinar on how to use MDX in your IBM Planning Analytics environment, part 2. A few quick notes as we get started. Today's event is being recorded for future viewing, and we can send a copy of these slides after the event. During the presentation, all attendees will be muted. If you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A section. We'll try to answer all questions as we go along, but if we're not able to do so during the session, then we could certainly answer them afterwards. My name is Lee Lazaro, and I am Revelwood's Planning Analytics Practice Leader. I have more than 20 years of OLAP implementation experience, most of which is associated with TM1 and Planning Analytics. And I'm joined today by my colleague Dylan Rossman, one of our consultants and our MDX expert. Dylan brings almost a decade of both financial and technical experience to the table, including serving as the lead consultant on many of our recent PA implementations. So for a quick overview of the agenda of what we're going to be talking about for the next 30 or so minutes, we want to first start by introducing Revelwood, let you know a little bit about us and why you're here and why you'd want to listen to us. And before we deep dive into part 2, we're going to do a brief refresher. And when I say brief, we're definitely going to do a very brief refresher of what we had talked about in the previous webinar. The main focus of what we're going to do is the third bullet of the agenda of going through some real world examples of some customer challenges and how we were able to solve them using various iterations of MDX. And then we'll talk a little bit about some next steps. Okay. So, to give a little bit of background of Revelwood, Revelwood is an IBM Gold business partner with a specialty in data science and business analytics. We've been in business for over 25 years helping FP&A professionals solve their business problems. We've performed hundreds of successful IBM Planning Analytics implementations worldwide with all types of companies. They span various industries, various sizes, and we have a very deep bench of certified PA consultants. At Revelwood, we pride ourselves in bringing both the technical experience and the business acumen needed to help with all of our FP&A needs. So jumping right into it, I wanted to start with just a brief refresher from our previous webinar. What is MDX? MDX stands for multidimensional expression, M-multi, D-dimensional. I know it's a little bit of a stretch, but X stands for expression. And really what MDX is, it's the multidimensional, it's the OLAP equivalent of SQL, and it's designed to pull information. We use SQL to query based on tables. We use MDX to query based on cubes. MDX is an industry standard language. So there are lots of people, lots of websites, lots of blogs, lots of documentation all about MDX. But the great thing about it is that there's also a specific TM1/Planning Analytics version. Okay? The Planning Analytics version of MDX doesn't support the entire MDX language, but in contrast to that, there are also specific functions and expressions that are added solely for TM1. Okay? And where do we use MDX? There's 3 areas that we use MDX. Area 1, dynamic subsets. This concept of using them in dynamic subsets gives you the ability to accommodate changing dimensions. This is where maybe there's new base level elements. Every month you might be adding new accounts. You want to be able to create a giant list. Dynamic subset gives us the ability to not have to update subsets or not have to update anything in the dimension. Maybe you want to be able to show all of the months within the current year. The concept of year is changing. This gives us the ability to update those elements, which transitions into the various reports. Those dynamic reports give us the opportunity to use these same subsets so that I can manipulate what accounts show. Gives me the opportunity for things like zero suppression. I want to add new departments. We're working with one organization right now that is in heavy acquisition mode, and we're able to use MDX to create dynamic rows to define all of the individual branches. And the third iteration is within Turbo Integrator. Within TI, this is an easy way to, I like to call it, reset the pieces that we use within a script. Maybe we're creating some kind of a view that we want to be able to use for zero out. Maybe we are creating some kind of a subset where we want to redefine our source. One of the things that I often find during health checks is I find organizations that have hard-coded something as their source. Hard-coded elements, hard-coded lists, hard-coded views. Anytime there's the phrase hard coded, it's relatively bad practice because that makes it not live. The fact that I would have to come in and customize scripting makes it hard for end users. Using the concept of dynamic, using the concept of MDX gives us the ability to make it live so that as your dimensions change, your source will be able to change. So as I said, this was a very, very high level overview of what we had talked about last time. But for those of you who weren't able to attend the first part of the session, I absolutely encourage you to go back and take a look at our webinar in regards to much more detail about all the things that we had just said. With that being said, now I'm going to transition it over to Dylan to take over and actually go through a lot of the use cases and a lot of the real life examples. Dylan.
Thank you, Lee. So like Lee mentioned, there are a lot of ways that we go about using MDX. One use case that we mentioned already, TI processes, right? So creating a base level subset to create a zero out view, like very common, as you're loading your GL actuals, for example, you probably have a data feed set up where you're loading in actuals however often you are. And when you're doing that, the typical approach is to zero out all the data that's in there before you load in new stuff, right? A common approach of doing that before, maybe you do something where you are looping through a particular dimension and grabbing all the base level elements with a while loop, right? So you see this is a pretty common approach, not the only approach, but a common one, where within the TI, we're going through and we're looping through the entire dimension. We are setting a variable, in this case, S element equal to each index within the dimension. So first index being the first element. And then we're just doing a check to say, is this a base level element? And if so, then we're going to add to a subset. And then from there, we just continue through the loop. And eventually we end up with a subset that contains all of our base level elements for a particular dimension. And then from there, we can append it to a view and we zero out the view, right? That's a pretty common approach. Again, it's not the only approach, but it's a common one. Now, all of this can be simplified with really one MDX statement. So if I go ahead and just look at the MDX approach, up top here, next to the bullet point, we have just a very generic MDX statement. Now, you'll see it is color-coded. Anything in the green is really think TM1 structure or pieces of TM1. Anything that's in blue is a MDX function. And then the red braces are really just to show the set, right? So in this case, I can go ahead and I can pass in a dimension name. So maybe account or department, etc. Pass it that piece over here in the square braces, right? Into this TM1 function called TM1 subset all, right? And what that'll do is that'll grab all the elements within that dimension, right? So then just from this piece right here, TM1 subset all, right? For this dimension, we have all the pieces. And then from there, we can pass through all those pieces to this function, TM1 filter by level, which will go ahead and filter it to whatever level we pass, in this case, 0. So 0 level, right? So just to recap what this is doing, grab all the pieces of this dimension, right? And then within that expression, within the result of that expression, go ahead and filter it down to just the base level, right? So really doing what we're doing here with the loop, where we're looking at each element within the dimension and then checking to see if it's a 0 level element or not. We can do that with one line of MDX, right? And very quickly that becomes the entire subset, right? So instead of doing the whole loop and doing the if checks and the while loop and all of that, I can say, here's my MDX statement, right? So you'll see here, I took the same MDX statement you see right above, and I actually plugged in a variable in there. So I plugged in a variable called sdim. So maybe that sdim is account or department again, what have you. So that variable will get concatenated into this MDX statement. So we'll end up with whatever the result of this variable is. And then we can go ahead and say subset create by MDX, which is a TI function, where I can say, here's the subset name. In this case, it's another variable called s0 out. Here's that MDX statement that we created over here in the variable. And then whatever dimension we're creating it in this case, sdim, which again could be anything, depends what the variable is. And just based off of that, we now have the same end result that we get by doing this approach, but we have it in a much simpler two-line approach. And it's also just generally more efficient to have the MDX do all the work rather than have to loop through the whole dimension and do if checks and all that kind of stuff. So this is just, it's simpler and cleaner in terms of your code, but it's also more efficient as well. All right. Another use case that we found is sometimes we want to create maybe a subset that shows all the current periods, right? Maybe you have a time dimension, right? And in that time dimension, you'll have all your years. Maybe you go down to years and then quarters and then months. Maybe you go further than months. In this case, we have weeks. Maybe you go down to days. But you have your time dimension, like shown here. And maybe you have a control cube as well, where you store a value such as the current year or the current month, something like that. Oftentimes, this will be used to set up your data load. So that way, it's always loading the current month once actuals are ready. That's typically a use case for the control cube. But you can also store the current year, and we can use these control cube values within the MDX statement itself, right? So if I go ahead and look at this, we can reference values stored in cubes, right? It doesn't have to be a control cube. It can be any cube, really. But for our purposes, we're just using this control cube example. And the way you do that is, again, you'll see color-coded in green. I have a expression here, which you'll see is cube dot, and then in parentheses, dimension dot element. And basically what this does is I can actually pull the cube value right here, and this will pull in this 2022, right? So if I specify a cube, right, where I have controls, in this case being my control cube up here, right? And then from there, I say, all right, for the control dimension, we're looking at current year, right? And then for the value dimension, we're looking at value. That's going to give me an intersection of current year and value of 2022. And when I do that in the MDX expression, it'll pull that value in. And from there, what I can do is I can actually concatenate that with other pieces of string, right? So you'll see outside of this green area, I have in quotes weeks in brackets dot, and then an opening, a beginning bracket, and then plus, and then at the end I have a plus and then an end bracket, right? These pluses basically work as a concatenation for strings. So really we're saying, take this string here of weeks dot opening bracket, concatenate it with the result of this expression right here, and then concatenate at the end this little end bracket, right? So what's going to happen is this is going to evaluate right here to 2022. And what this is going to do is it's going to say, take this weeks dot open bracket, put the 2022 in there, put the ending bracket, and that'll give me weeks dot 2022, right? And then from there, once we have the full string, we can use this function called str to member or string to member. And with that, you can basically take some kind of combination of strings and turn it into a member. So once we have the full string evaluated within this function, this function will say, okay, take that full string and now turn that into a member. So the member in this case would be 2022, because it's going to be weeks dot 2022, pulling from the control cube here, evaluated from this expression over here. Now, what you're going to see, I can take that and take it up another level. So I can pull in, if I just left this as the str to member, weeks dot, and then this expression over here, controls dot control dot current year, etc. That would give me 2022. But what I can do with the result of this expression, right? So everything within the string to member, I could then pass that result into another function, which I believe we covered last time, called descendants, right? And what that descendants function will do is go ahead and grab everything underneath whatever we're passing into it. So in this case, once we evaluate this cube value here, right, we're going to get weeks.2022. We pass in a string to member. That'll give us 2022. And then from there, we can pass that into descendants, and that will go ahead and it'll grab all the pieces underneath it. So from 2022 all the way down, in our case, to weeks, right? So 2022, the quarters, the months, the weeks, everything gets pulled in. And you'll see on the right, this is within Paul, but within the MDX editor, you see I just put in the same expression, and this is the end result. So this gives you a dynamic subset that will always have the current year in it, right? Very simple example of the power of this. You can definitely take this a lot further with other dimensions, or using more MDX functions on top of this. But this is just a simple example showing, what? I don't ever need to change this subset again. As long as I update the control cube, I'm always going to have a subset that gives me all the current periods. I don't need to go ahead and create a new one for 2023 and 2024 and 2025. This will always be dynamic in the sense that it will pull in the value from the control cube. All right, now let's transition into some more in-depth MDX within Excel, some live demonstrations. So I'm going to stop sharing for a moment as I open up my Excel file and get logged in, and then I'll share again for you guys. All right. Okay, so let me share my screen. All right. So what you're going to see on my screen right now, it's a very basic Excel report. This is really just something I generated out of packs by converting from a dynamic report. But what you're going to see is we have a base MDX here. So I have something doing just taking descendants and passing in net income and grabbing all the pieces underneath that, right? So this is a very simple example. You'll see my result over here. Oh, let me get rid of that. My result over here is I have a row set with all of my descendants of net income, right? So if I scroll it down, this is everything that makes up net income in the system that I'm using for this, right? So very simple. I can go ahead and I can update the year, and I can change it to a January period, and everything updates. It's all dynamic in the sense that it's zero suppressed, and all the cells will update with data. So it's completely dynamic with an MDX statement. Now, I can take this another step further. So one thing that I like to do within my Excel reports, when applicable, is I can utilize the power of Excel as well as the power of MDX, right? So right now I have just this base MDX, it's a static MDX statement. As any new accounts get added or data changes, this will be dynamic in the sense that the rows will update. But the MDX statement itself is not dynamic. But this is where I can use the power of Excel, right? So if I just grab this, what you'll see is in the Excel bar over here, in the formula bar over here, I took the same statement you saw in the base MDX and I turned it into a concatenation of parts of the MDX statement as well as a cell reference, right? So I went ahead and I said, let me take descendants and BPM account, but I don't want to be limited to just net income. I want to be able to change it to whatever account root I want, right? So you'll see down below, I have a little selection for account root. This is just a sub NM formula. So I basically just broke apart this MDX statement, and within there, I concatenated right in the middle of it. You'll see right here, that cell reference to my sub NM formula. So if I hit enter right now, you'll see that this evaluates to the same thing, except instead of net income, we evaluate to whatever my account root is at the moment. So right now it's other expenses. And if I were to go ahead and take this and let's say I changed the MDX statement I'm using to this new MDX statement, and let that evaluate for a second. You'll see now I have other expenses because it's now using the second MDX statement, which is referencing other expenses. But where this comes into play is if I were to go ahead and change this account root from other expenses to, let's say, gross margin, right? You'll see in line 2 over here for the dynamic MDX, this updates the gross margin, and as a result, my row set updates gross margin. So this gives me the ability to change my account root and completely change what is showing on my report. So I'm no longer limited to whatever the MDX statement is. I'm now able to actually make the MDX statement itself dynamic in the sense that I can change it on the fly using the Excel functionality. And again, I could change this again to, let's say, back to net income, for example. So we'll just go back to the original statement we had above. This will evaluate, we'll get all our rows. Everything's great. Sometimes utilizing this, I'll create a report. Maybe I'll have something instead of having a net income report and a balance sheet report. In this case, I can do both, right? I can have net income as my account root, and maybe I want to switch over to balance sheet, and very quickly, just like that, I now have a balance sheet report without having to go back and forth between 2 different Excel files. I can very easily go back and forth between balance sheet and your P&L. So let's see here. And there we go. Now we have our balance sheet. So let me just go back again to, let's go back to gross margin just to keep it simple. All right. So far we looked at, I can have a static MDX statement here, which is great. If it accomplishes what you need, perfect. But this idea of a dynamic MDX statement kind of gives you another level of dynamic ability within your Excel reports. Now, you'll notice here I have 2 columns, one for actuals, one for final budget, and I have one for variance. And you'll see that there is a value right here, by design. I promise, not accidental. And this variance right now, there is no element that stores the variance. I could do this with an Excel formula, but there actually is a new function in Planning Analytics for Excel that allows you to define custom calculations for your Excel report and reference that. So in my example, I want to create a variance, right? So what I can do is if I were to go ahead and grab this right here, you'll see I have this new function called define calc. And with that define calc function, I can reference, what my TM1 server name is, and then I basically give it a name in MDX form. So in this case, I want this to be in the scenario dimension. So it's BPM scenario dot whatever name I give it. In this case, I just gave the name variance. But you can really call it whatever you want, as long as it's unique. It doesn't correspond with something that already exists in your system within the scenario dimension. And the next parameter you'll see right here is within MDX again, I can utilize this to create a calculation. So you see that this is a very simple calculation of actuals right here minus final budget, right? So that will give me my variance of take my actuals minus my final budget. There's my variance. You can absolutely make this as complex as needed to fit your requirements. For example, you can do things in MDX like if statements and stuff like that. Because I know sometimes you want actuals minus final budget for certain accounts, and maybe for other accounts you want it to be the reverse, where you have final budget minus actuals, depending on what the account is doing. Because obviously, if you have less expenses, that's not a bad thing. So there is flexibility in that sense, but this is just a simple example. So if I have this defined calc set up and I hit enter right now, you're going to see it gave me a result of variance, right? So it just says variance, that's the result. But what I can do is if I refresh right now, what you're going to see is now I have values here. So I can actually now reference the word variance. I don't have to reference the cell that contains the formula. I can reference anything now that contains the word variance within my DBRWs, as you'll see right here. And I now have that calculation being done via MDX. So I don't need to set up a rule within my model, because I know some people do that. They set up a rule to do their variance, which can really blow up your feeder size for your system, for your rule file, very quickly. Because just imagine you're calculating variance for every single combination here, versus I can do this on the fly with MDX, right? By just saying take actuals minus final budget and give me the end result here that I can now reference with this new defined calc function. So I found that to be a great addition. And just another side note on that defined calc function, anyone that has used perspectives before, where maybe remember you could previously reference a subset and get the total for that, you can accomplish the same thing now in Planning Analytics for Excel with the defined calc function as well. So you do have that capability as well. All right, so far what we did, again, we set up this dynamic MDX statement via just Excel functionality. We introduced this concept of the defined calc function, which is a new function within Excel for Planning Analytics. And we see now I have my actuals, my final budget, and the variance. So I could take this even further if I want. You may have noticed underneath the account root over here, there's another field called variance threshold, right? So maybe I have this set up where I'm now getting my variance, and I see I have some big ones like a $19 million sales variance. That's huge. But I also have these ones like $175 other sales. I don't know if I really care about that. So this is where I can introduce another TM1 function called the filter function. So within TM1, I can filter by any cube value or any result of a calculation. So you'll see in my example here, I have in the middle of the filter function, so I have my descendants, BPM account, gross margin, right? So far we have within this function, same MDX expression we have over here. The difference is within the filter, you're going to see after the comma, I'm now referencing similar to how we pulled the cube values for the control cube to filter the dimension, the time dimension. I can do the same thing for this filter dimension here, for this filter function here, by pulling in BPM finance. And then you'll see right here, I pull in actuals, right? And I subtract. So again, I can do that type of math with MDX. I subtract final budget. So essentially, I'm basically copying the same logic that I use for this defined calc above, of saying, take BPM scenario, take actuals, subtract out final budget. So I'm taking that same approach right here, and now I'm feeding that into the filter where I'm saying, take the results of this MDX statement, the results being all these accounts here that are underneath gross margin, and let's go ahead and pass that into a filter function in MDX, right? So filter. And let's go ahead and filter it by this condition right here. So everything after this comma right here is the condition. So the condition being actuals minus final budget, actuals minus final budget is greater than this amount. So in this case, this amount, using my Excel functionality, I linked up to this cell that I labeled variance threshold, right? So now I have a fully dynamic MDX statement using Excel functionality, and I'm also going to filter my data by a variance, which I'm also displaying using this define calc function. So a lot of things going on right now, but what you're going to see when I go ahead and move this over to no longer reference this MDX function, actually reference the filtered one, if I hit enter, it's going to go ahead and pull in. You'll see all the variances now are greater than 500,000. So it took out all those other rows that I don't care about, because maybe I'm just looking at some kind of variance report. And if it's not, let's say, let me just put it back to 0 just to illustrate. You know, I don't really care about this 175. I don't need to see this. Maybe I have a bunch of more. Maybe if I go to something like, let's say net income, which is going to have a lot more results. You know, I see a 175 here. I see a 737 here, an 85 here. From my perspective, maybe I don't really care about $85. Maybe it doesn't matter to me. It's not material enough. But maybe 25,000 is my cutoff, right? Maybe I say $25,000 variance. That's when I start to care, and that's just me picking an arbitrary number. And you'll see just like that, I can filter out all my rows here that are below $25,000 variance. So if you look through all my rows, you're not going to see anything with a variance less than $25,000. So very easily, I can have a report that gives me variances, and I can set thresholds. I can say greater than or less than, what have you. And this is really just a very simple way to utilize this type of functionality. This can be applied any number of different ways. So just to recap, what did we do, right? We started with the base MDX, which is great. You know, it gave us what we needed for net income, but we then took it up a notch and said, you know, maybe we want to be able to change it where I can go ahead and I can flip from net, you know, all the descendants of net income to all the descendants of other expenses, etc. And we did so utilizing, again, just Excel functionality, right? Setting this part within quotes as a string, concatenating it with a cell reference, and then concatenating it again with the ending brace in parenthesis, right? And that gave us a dynamic MDX statement. And then we went ahead and took it up another level and said, what if we want to create a variance on the fly using MDX, right? We can now do that with this new define calc function, where I can say within the define calc function, here's the calc name. Here is the MDX expression. Here's the math that we're doing of actuals minus final budget. And that'll give us something that we can now reference and pull these values via DBRW. And then we took up another notch and said, I want to take this new variance that I created and I want to filter by it to only show the pieces that I actually care about, because I don't need to see variances that are immaterial to me. So we went ahead and did that by using the filter function and combining it with some of the dynamic pieces of Excel functionality, using cell references and putting that within the MDX expression itself. So taking all those steps, we now have a report that's very dynamic, very adjustable. I can change my variance threshold. I can change my account root. I can change my period, and all those changes will change the data and change the row set that I'm looking at. You know, if I look at January 2015 right now, that'll give me a different row set than what I'm looking at right here. So you just end up with a very dynamic and customizable report that changes based on changes I'm making here on the fly. So with that said, let me stop my share. Back to you, Lee.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Dylan. That was great. Hopefully everybody was able to learn something new, get something out of it, and more importantly, think through some practical applications of some of the challenges that you may be facing right now with some reports or some usage of this. Okay. Oh, going forward, Revelwood is here to help with this and any other aspects. We regularly host IBM Planning Analytics webinars. We post a weekly blog series that provides tips and tricks about many different topics, technical tips, business concepts, and overall ideas just to help improve your processes. So to see a list of all of our past events, please visit our YouTube site. And also I encourage everyone to follow me on LinkedIn for the weekly updates that we provide. Well, thank you very much for attending today's call. I hope this presentation gave you some new ideas for your PA modeling, and we would appreciate you taking a few minutes with us over the next few weeks just for a brief chat. In the next day or so, myself or one of my colleagues will be reaching out to you to get some feedback and just have a brief conversation. But in the meantime, please don't hesitate to contact me if you have any questions about today's topic or anything else related to your planning analytics environment. And that concludes today's webinar.